Today, we are talking about the low sulfur diet, and more importantly, why it exists at all. This is one of those topics that tends to find people when they're already really sick and nothing else has explained what's going on. I see this over and over in my practice. People who've tried the low FODMAP, tried cutting out foods, tried gluten-free, dairy-free, tried doing low carb. I mean, tried so many diets, tried doing all the right things, and are still feeling deeply unwell after eating. So, in this episode, I'm going to walk you through what sulfur is, why some people suddenly stop tolerating it, and how a short low sulfur diet trial can act as a clarity tool, not a forever diet, to help us understand what your gut is actually struggling with underneath. If you're here because you've been Googling low sulfur diet and nothing is making sense, you're probably dealing with symptoms that feel random or confusing. Maybe you feel like you react to foods that are supposed to be healthy. Maybe your symptoms feel random, cyclical, or impossible to predict. Or maybe you've already tried other diets and you're just still not feeling well. So here's the first thing I want you to know. Sulfur itself is not bad. Your body actually needs sulfur for detoxification, antioxidant production, and overall cellular health. Research shows that sulfur-containing amino acids are key contributors to antioxidant systems like glutathione and other cellular defense mechanisms. Sulfur actually shows up naturally in many foods because it's part of key amino acids that make up protein, which is one of the main dietary sources of sulfur. Methionine and cysteine are the primary sulfur-containing amino acids incorporated into protein. So sulfur is actually present across a wide range of foods from protein, but also produce, certain fruits and vegetables. And it's completely normal to consume sulfur in foods every day. So, that said, for some people, sulfur can build up faster than their system can process it. Foods that are otherwise healthy can still be foods with high sulfur, which can start triggering uncomfortable symptoms in these people. And I see this pattern regularly in my work with clients who feel absolutely miserable, even when they're eating what would normally be considered a very balanced, healthy diet with lots of nutrition because a lot of our healthy foods are actually high sulfur, and we're going to talk about what those foods are in this episode. So, in our GI focused dietitian practice, we use the low sulfur diet as a temporary trial. It is not a forever way of eating. So, this is not about avoiding all the foods with sulfur or following a restrictive low sulfur diet long term. The goal is not restriction, it's getting information. A short trial can help us understand whether the overall load from foods high in sulfur may be contributing to symptoms while also giving us clues about what actually needs to be addressed underneath. So, today in this episode, I'm going to walk you through what sulfur is, why some people struggle with it, what symptoms might suggest sulfur intolerance, and how a low sulfur dietary trial can help you make sense of what's going on. I'll also explain why this diet is never meant to be a long-term solution, how we think about root causes like hydrogen sulfide overgrowth in the context of a low sulfur diet for SIBO, and what the next steps usually look like after the trial. Along the way, I'll share real client stories and practical guidance so you can decide whether this approach makes sense for you. Now, if you guys are ready to dive in and really see what a low sulfur diet actually looks like, make sure and download my free low sulfur diet guide. It's a PDF, it's a full low sulfur food list and guide along with a 7-day meal plan to help you try this approach without having to plan every last meal on your own. So that diet plan is in the show notes. All right. So, what is sulfur and why is it in so many foods? So, let's start with the basics because sulfur can sound a little mysterious if you've never thought about it before. Sulfur is actually a completely natural mineral that your body uses every single day. It's part of two important amino acids, methionine and cysteine, which means it shows up in a lot of foods we eat, especially protein rich foods. That's totally normal and totally expected, and it's why many everyday foods are considered important dietary sources of sulfur. You'll also find sulfur in veggies like garlic, onions, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, along with things like coffee, black tea, dried fruit, wine, and even certain preservatives called sulfites. So if you have ever looked at a list of foods containing sulfur, and wondered why it feels like everything is on it, this is why. My experience over the years has shown that most people tolerate sulfur containing foods just fine, and they play an important role in a balanced diet. The part that surprises people is that the high sulfur foods are not actually the problem. These foods are healthy and important. Symptoms show up when your body has trouble processing sulfur efficiently, and that's when things start to feel unpredictable. One day, broccoli or eggs feel fine, and the next day, they leave you bloated or uncomfortable. When I see this kind of on again, off again reaction with my clients, it usually tells me their system might be overwhelmed by sulfur, not because foods high in sulfur are inherently bad, but because their gut needs a little more support. So let's talk about when sulfur becomes a problem. So, because if sulfur is something your body needs, why does it bother some people and not others? This is usually the point where clients look at me and say, okay, but why am I reacting to it? And honestly, that's a great question because sulfur itself isn't the issue. The real problem shows up when sulfur builds up faster than your body can move it through with its normal pathways. And that's where symptoms start to pop up and feel maybe random or out of proportion with what you ate. There are a few common reasons why this happens, and these are patterns I see all the time in our practice with our patients. One of the biggest is hydrogen sulfide overgrowth, meaning certain gut bacteria are producing excess hydrogen sulfide gas as a byproduct of sulfur metabolism in the intestine. When that happens, we often see people become extremely sensitive to foods with sulfur, even when their diet looks balanced and healthy on paper. This can happen in the small intestine or the large intestine, this hydrogen sulfide overproduction. And either way, it can make sulfur tolerance feel unpredictable. And we are going to have a full episode dedicated to hydrogen sulfide SIBO. So stay tuned for that. That is one of the main causes of sulfur intolerance. So stay tuned for that. All right. So we actually do see this quite a bit in our practice. And one of my clients, Doug, who actually he's sharing his story, we're going to post that this month as well on the podcast. When he first came to me, he was eating almost nothing but chicken and rice because everything else just made him feel awful. He kept trying to do all the right things. He was trying to actually eat healthier and add more vegetables to his diet. So he was adding broccoli, garlic, many foods that actually fall under the high sulfur foods list to avoid for someone in this situation. And each time he would end up bloated, foggy, just completely wiped out. Once we stepped back and looked at the pattern, it became clear that sulfur was a big trigger for him. When he tried a low sulfur diet trial, we did a 2 week trial. Those reactions started to calm down pretty quickly. And that early shift was huge because it gave us the clarity we needed to understand what his gut was struggling with and where to focus our work next. So stay tuned for more information on Doug because he has a very interesting story and very encouraging story because he's doing great now. Another reason sulfur becomes harder to handle is when someone is naturally eating a very sulfur heavy diet or taking supplements like NAC, glutathione, MSM, or alpha lipoic acid. And these are supplements that are great in the right context. So I'm not saying these are bad supplements at all, but these are supplements that contain sulfur. So if your sulfur pathways are already taxed, adding more can tip you over the edge. And I've seen this happen in clients who felt worse after, quote, detox supplements and couldn't figure out why. Slow gut motility or constipation can play a role too. When food and waste linger in the digestive tract, gut bacteria have more opportunity to produce certain gases, including hydrogen sulfide. So, I've also worked with people who have variations in their sulfur producing pathways, which can make them more sensitive to foods with a high sulfur content, even when their overall diet looks fairly typical. So, the main takeaway is sulfur intolerance is never the actual root cause. It's simply a clue that something deeper in your gut needs attention. And this is really where the work begins. In our practice, we're a group of GI focused dietitians. We use these clues to uncover what's driving the sensitivity in the first place, whether that's motility issues, microbial imbalances, or sulfur processing pathways that need support. So again, the goal is not to avoid sulfur forever. The goal is to fix what's underneath so you can get back to tolerating a wide variety of foods without feeling like you have to tiptoe around your diet. All right, now before we go any further, it helps to know what sulfur sensitivity actually looks like in real life. The symptoms can show up in different ways depending on what's happening underneath. But there are a few clear patterns I see over and over again with my clients. So let's walk through those next. All right, so sulfur sensitivity can show up in many different ways. Now, none of these symptoms are exclusive to sulfur, which is why people can often spend months or years trying to make sense of their symptoms. Each one by itself can look like something else entirely, but when several show up together, especially in response to a food high in sulfur, that's when sulfur lands on my radar. One of the most common symptoms I see is a bloating or discomfort after high sulfur foods like eggs, garlic, onions, broccoli, cauliflower, wine, or even coffee. For some people, the reaction is immediate. For others, it hits later as digestion moves along. Diarrhea or constipation can also show up, and many people cycle between the two with no predictable pattern. Now, other symptoms I see, because those symptoms I just listed just sound like IBS, right? But keeping in mind that sulfur intolerance or hydrogen sulfide, SIBO, or overgrowth could be at the root cause of your IBS. But those symptoms themselves are typical IBS symptoms. So we want to take that, but we want to look for other things that point us in the direction of sulfur as well. So other symptoms that I see include fatigue, brain fog, puffiness, achiness, tingling, or just this sense that the body feels weighed down and inflamed. Now, with sulfur sensitivity, this is not subtle. And clinically, the people who struggle the most with sulfur overload are the ones who tell me they feel deeply sick, not just a little off, but truly unwell, almost toxic on a day-to-day basis. These are the people who they're really, really feeling miserable. The other symptoms we can see show up, bladder irritation might be a clue. And that doesn't mean that you have like a UTI that you didn't know about. It's just that I've seen cases where bladder symptoms seem to track with the same sulfur-related gut patterns, which can make the bladder feel more reactive when sulfur processing is stressed. And that's because some of the bacteria that can be involved in bladder infections or UTIs are the same bacteria that produce these hydrogen sulfide gases. So this is just another helpful breadcrumb, especially when the picture is otherwise confusing. Another clue might be feeling worse with Epsom salt baths or magnesium sulfate, which are normally soothing for most people. But if your sulfur pathways are struggling, this can actually make your symptoms flare. One of the clearest examples of this was with my client Beth, who also shared her full story in a previous podcast episode. So just look for Beth's podcast episode if you'd like to hear her story. But she spent most of her adult life feeling sick after almost every meal. And I mean, truly sick to the point where she didn't remember what normal felt like. And she thought that everyone just felt crappy after they ate. During her low sulfur trial, she told me she finished dinner one night, sat on the couch, and it just hit her that she didn't feel awful. And that single moment of not feeling sick was her first real clue that all this time sulfur overload had been part of her story. And it finally gave her direction after years of feeling lost. So these symptoms, they don't diagnose sulfur intolerance, but they can absolutely point us toward whether sulfur is part of the puzzle and whether a short, gentle trial might bring some much needed clarity. All right, so now let's talk about the low sulfur trial that I'm talking about. And before we talk about the trial itself, it's important to say this. Feeling unwell after eating does not automatically mean you need a low sulfur diet. There are a lot of different types of food intolerances out there, and symptoms often overlap. What we're really looking for is a pattern of symptoms from the list that I just went through. And just to be clear, you absolutely do not need to have all of those symptoms. I've actually never worked with anyone who did have that whole list of symptoms, but when you have the gut symptoms paired with a couple of those other broader symptoms in the body, that's a clue. And then we do the low sulfur dietary trial to give us even more clarity. So the low sulfur diet is exactly what it sounds like, a short temporary experiment to help us understand whether sulfur is contributing to your symptoms. It's not meant to be restrictive, and it's definitely not something to stay on long term. In my practice, we typically use it for about 1 to 2 weeks, just long enough to see whether symptoms shift when sulfur load comes down. The goal here is not perfection. You are not eliminating every molecule of sulfur from your diet. You're simply lowering the total amount coming in so we can get a clearer picture of what's happening underneath. And that usually means leaning more heavily on low sulfur vegetables and simpler meals while temporarily limiting high sulfur options. Because sulfur shows up in so many everyday foods, people are often surprised by how quickly they notice the difference when sulfur really is a part of their issue. I've seen clients who felt sick after every meal suddenly recognize within just a few days that certain foods weren't triggering them anymore once the total sulfur load dropped. That kind of information is incredibly helpful because it tells us whether sulfur overload is part of the picture or whether we need to focus our attention somewhere else. Think of this trial as data gathering. It's a way to give your system a little breathing room so we can watch for patterns. Many people find it helpful to work from a list of low sulfur foods during this phase so that they're not guessing or overthinking every meal. And we do have a list like that. If you want to dive in and do the low sulfur trial, we have a free guide in the show notes. So go over to the show notes and download that low sulfur guide. It gives you a complete food list and a 7-day meal plan. So once we do the trial and we have that clarity, the next step is always to address the root cause so you can get back to enjoying a wide variety of foods again without feeling like you're walking through a minefield. All right, so once we decide a low sulfur trial makes sense to do, the next question is always, okay, so what do I actually eat? And the good news is that this doesn't have to be complicated. The goal is simply to lower your sulfur load for a short period so we can watch for changes, not to eliminate every single source of sulfur or make your diet feel tiny. During the trial, we temporarily reduce foods that are naturally high in sulfur. That usually includes things like eggs, shellfish, garlic, onions, leeks, shallots. any of those foods in the allium, it's called the allium family. So garlic, onions, leeks, shallots, any of the foods in the cruciferous family. So that's broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, dried fruit, because sulfites are often added to preserve it, grapes, because sulfites are often sprayed onto grapes, wine and beer, which are preserved with sulfites, coffee, black tea, and other foods or drinks that may have sulfite preservatives, which you will be able to see on an ingredient list. These are healthy foods. Most people tolerate them beautifully once the underlying issue is resolved, but during the trial, pulling them back helps us see whether they're contributing to symptoms. From there, we build meals around foods that tend to be easier to tolerate. We usually focus on non-allium, non-cruciferous vegetables like zucchini, peppers, carrots, cucumbers, lettuce, spinach, along with grains like rice, oats, and quinoa, maybe starches like potatoes, lactose-free dairy, and most nuts and seeds. We also pay attention to fruits we include fruits that are low in sulfur, like berries and citrus, just basically avoiding foods or fruits that have added sulfites. We do intentionally keep protein portions more moderate during this phase since sulfur is part of amino acids. Remember those two amino acids, methionine and cysteine, is in protein foods. Now, in most cases, protein does not need to be extremely low to see meaningful symptom relief. We typically choose protein sources that are a little gentler, not a lot of red meat or fatty meats, just for gut issues in general. So maybe poultry and certain fish. If you Google a low sulfur diet, which you might have done already, you'll find that the most kind of aggressive versions of this diet are almost vegetarian. I have found in practice with our clients that typically it's not necessary to reduce protein that low. Most people do fine with moderate protein intake, which you'll see in the guide, but it usually means limiting your protein portion per meal to about 4 ounces, which is not too bad. And then you can make adjustments also just depending on how your body responds. Now, supplements are another area where sulfur can really sneak in. So supplements like NAC, which is N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, MSM, alpha lipoic acid, DMSO, and glucosamine sulfate can all add to the sulfur load. And these are pretty common supplements, especially in the gut health world. So these supplements are useful, great supplements in the right context, but while you're doing the trial, we often pause them so we're not muddying the waters. All right. So I've repeated this many times so far, but the low sulfur diet is not a long-term solution. Your body absolutely needs sulfur. It's involved in detoxification, making glutathione, which is your master antioxidant, supporting connective tissue, helping with hormone pathways, and even keeping your metabolism running smoothly. High sulfur foods are incredibly nutritious foods. So the goal is never to avoid these forever. It's to understand why your body isn't handling sulfur right now and to reduce your overall sulfur load in the short term. And so this is why I think of the low sulfur diet trial kind of like a flashlight. It shines light on what's happening underneath the symptoms so we can figure out what actually needs attention. If someone feels dramatically better during this short trial, that tells us we're on the right track. And if they don't, that also gives us valuable information about where to look next. Either way, it's simply a clarity tool, never a long-term solution. Now, if you remember Beth from earlier, her experience is also a perfect example of why the low sulfur diet is not a solution. It's a clue. She had dealt with digestive issues for most of her life, but things became unbearable in her late 20s and early 30s. She was bloated, uncomfortable, exhausted, dealing with bowel urgency, and eventually eating little more than chicken and rice because everything else made her feel awful. Multiple doctors had told her it was just IBS. She was put on the low FODMAP diet for years, even though it never fully helped. And when she came to me, she was on the low FODMAP diet, had been for years. And in fact, she was eating way fewer foods than are even allowed on that diet and still honestly feeling miserable and toxic and reacting and feeling yucky. Her stomach hurt after every single meal. And she was terrified to eat anything outside of that tiny list of foods that she had whittled her diet down to over the years. So she was scared, depleted, eating fewer and fewer foods. And she told me her expectations were low. She said, I don't expect you to fix me. I just would like help figuring out how to eat maybe a few more foods and not feel so sick every day. Based on her symptoms and her intake patterns, we actually shifted her off the low FODMAP gradually and into a low sulfur trial. And honestly, she felt relief so quickly, it almost didn't seem real to her. She cried telling me that she was able to eat fruits she had avoided for years. Fruits she loved, but they were high FODMAP, so she was avoiding them because she was terrified that they were going to worsen her bloating, her pain, or her urgency to run to the bathroom. And she was eating them again and actually feeling better than she had in years. And what really stopped both of us in our tracks was when we stepped back and looked at her symptom pattern over time. The flares she had always described as cyclical. So she had told me when she first came to me, she said, my symptoms are cyclical. They would happen like once every, well, she would always feel crappy, but her symptoms would flare up and be worse every few weeks. And I was thinking, cyclical, that wasn't really ringing any bells for me. Well, this suddenly makes sense once we identified the sulfur issue because the flares lined up almost perfectly with the meals. She meal prepped a dish that was heavy in eggs. So she meal prepped and she had a rotation of dishes. And every 3 weeks or so, there was a meal heavy in eggs. And that was when her symptoms were flaring up. And so once we saw that pattern, things were starting to really click all over the place. Her sulfur load was the missing piece that explained why her symptoms kept cycling instead of staying constant. So we later ran a lactulose breath test, a hydrogen methane breath test to see if there were any patterns of overgrowth of microbes in her intestine. And we found a hydrogen sulfide overgrowth pattern in the breath tests. And once we addressed that root cause, not only did she tolerate more foods, she actually returned to a full, vibrant diet. She was able to travel. She took a trip to Europe that she had been putting off for years. She was like, Alyssa, Europe doesn't have bathrooms everywhere like we have here. You can't go there if you have urgency and diarrhea all the time. So she was actually able to go to Europe, exercise comfortably, and just live her life without constantly scanning for bathrooms. And Beth's story is exactly why the low sulfur diet is not a solution. It's the clue that points us toward the real solution because if we hadn't gone on and rebalanced her gut microbiome so her gut would stop producing excess hydrogen sulfide gas, her solution still would have been dietary restriction, which would have made it very hard to travel and do all the things she wanted to do and experience the freedom in her life because she would have had to avoid onion and garlic, which I tell you what, they are everywhere when you're dining out in restaurants and just in almost every cuisine in the world has onion and garlic in their cuisine. So the goal is always with our clients and in general with gut health. And you guys, you probably don't hear this a lot because in the gut health world, there's so much talk about restriction and avoidance and elimination. But let me tell you, when we zoom out and look at the big picture of your life, the goal should always be to widen your diet back out, to rebuild resilience in your gut and to help you feel confident eating a variety of foods again. Restriction is never the end point. It can be a temporary way to get clarity, but clarity is what we're going for with these therapeutic diet protocols. So now let's talk a little bit more about how hydrogen sulfide SIBO fits into the picture. And we're not going to go too far down this rabbit hole because we're going to release a whole episode on this topic. But stories like Beth's almost always open the door to this bigger conversation about hydrogen sulfide SIBO because it's one of the most common reasons I see people struggle with sulfur-rich foods in the first place. In these cases, certain gut bacteria, most commonly a bacteria called desulfovibrio, but there are others, they produce excess hydrogen sulfide gas as a byproduct of sulfur metabolism in the intestine. And that gas can make even very healthy foods trigger symptoms, make you feel healthy, irritate your body and your gut lining. And this is why the low sulfur diet can be such a helpful short-term tool in the context of hydrogen sulfide SIBO or hydrogen sulfide bacterial overgrowth in the gut. Now, I should specify this. The low sulfur diet does not solve the overgrowth or the SIBO on its own, but it can be a clue, as we've been talking about this whole episode, it can be a clue to reveal if hydrogen sulfide activity might be part of what's going on. And then you would want to clarify that with a breath test. But it can also be a temporary way in the context of this hydrogen sulfide to calm the symptoms down while you're working on getting testing and treatment. So again, we're going to break this down much more fully in a separate episode, and we can understand how hydrogen sulfide really fits into the picture and, how to figure that out and then what to do about it. So now I want to talk a little bit about what not to do, because whenever I talk about the low sulfur diet, I always like to include a few things not to do because this is one of those areas where it's really easy to go overboard or misunderstand the whole point of the trial. Now, I am starting to feel like a broken record. So the first one is don't avoid sulfur forever. We need these sulfur-rich foods. They're incredibly nutritious. Your body genuinely needs them. If they're causing symptoms, that's a sign something deeper needs attention. The second thing, don't cut protein drastically. So sulfur is part of amino acids. People sometimes assume they should avoid protein altogether. And like I said, some of the strictest versions of the low sulfur diet out there are essentially vegetarian or even close to vegan. But in my experience, I've worked with quite a few patients with sulfur sensitivity. That level of restriction is almost never necessary. And protein is essential for blood sugar stability, hormone production, immune health, so many things. So during the low sulfur trial, we simply keep protein portions moderate and choose protein sources that tend to be gentler for this short window rather than eliminating them altogether. So I would use the protein portion specified in my low sulfur guide as a starting point. And then if you feel like, okay, this is helping, but let's see if it can help a little more, you can maybe titrate the protein down just a tad, but typically we don't have to avoid it or go super low in protein. Now, third, don't guess at supplements. If you are taking things like NAC, glutathione, MSM, alpha lipoic acid, or glucosamine sulfate, they can add to your overall sulfur load significantly. And again, these are fine supplements to take in general, but during the trial, removing high sulfur supplements helps us interpret what's actually affecting your symptoms. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to know whether the diet is helping or if the supplements are muddying the picture. I've had clients that didn't want to go off their glucosamine because it's helping with their joints. And I understand that. And we do have to weigh out the pros and cons. So, maybe there are cases where certain supplements can be so important that we don't want to stop them. But I would strongly recommend it's just a short-term trial, a week or two. If you feel like you can live or get away without taking these supplements for a week or two, do it so you can get a clear result from your trial. Fourth, don't interpret the trial as a diagnosis. Feeling better on a low sulfur diet does not automatically mean you've diagnosed yourself with sulfur intolerance or hydrogen sulfide SIBO. What it really tells us is that sulfur is worth looking at more closely. The why we're trying to understand is whether certain bacteria in the gut are producing too much hydrogen sulfide gas, which is often what drives sulfur intolerance in the first place, or whether it's something else that's leading to the sulfur sensitivity. So the next step, if symptoms improve during the trial, is usually to run a breath test that can measure hydrogen sulfide levels to see whether an overgrowth may be part of the picture. And this is one of the tests we order for our private clients to help inform our nutrition and lifestyle interventions. And it helps us understand what the diet is pointing to. The diet gives us clues. The testing helps us connect the clues to what's actually happening in the gut. And fifth, don't assume that everyone needs this diet. Sulfur intolerance is real, but it's not universal, and it's not the answer for every digestive symptom. The people who benefit most are the ones who recognize a pattern in the symptoms we talked about earlier. If you don't see yourself in that group, it probably is not the right tool, and that's valuable information too. And one of the most important things to know about the low sulfur trial is that any clear response, good or bad, is valuable information. If you feel noticeably better, that tells us sulfur load is playing a meaningful role. If you feel noticeably worse, that also matters because it can help us understand what pathways might need support or whether something else is going on underneath. Either way, those shifts are helpful clues, not failures. If you reach this point and you're still feeling unsure about what all of this means, that's usually the time to get a little guidance. Sulfur metabolism is complex, and the gut mechanics behind hydrogen sulfide can be even more so. Working with someone who understands these pathways can save you months or even years of trial and error, especially if your symptoms have been confusing or unpredictable for a long time. A trained eye can help you piece together the full picture from diet patterns to supplement load to breath test results and make sure you're not spinning your wheels or restricting foods unnecessarily. So, if you're feeling overwhelmed or you'd like a clear starting point, make sure you download our low sulfur diet guide and meal plan that we've created. That's in the show notes. It will give you a simple, structured way to try the diet without having to piece everything together on your own. And it's a great way to gather helpful information before deciding on your next steps. And it's especially helpful because it's a free guide. So it's especially helpful if you're just starting out and maybe you're not ready yet to decide if you need personalized support. You'd like to understand your body a little bit better first. But if you're listening to this and thinking you might need more individualized support, that's especially important when it comes to the root cause work because the low sulfur diet is really just a short-term clarifying tool, but the part that actually decreases sulfur sensitivity and helps you tolerate a wide variety of foods does require a personalized plan. And that's where working closely with a clinician who understands sulfur pathways, gut mechanics, and hydrogen sulfide patterns becomes invaluable. So if that's where you're at, you're always welcome to schedule a strategy call with me, which is simply a chance to talk at a high level about what you're dealing with and see whether working together would be a good next step.